Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
I'm Jamie Beebe.
And I'm Jake Deptula. We're the host of the Strictly Stalking podcast.
Strictly Stalking is a true crime podcast that explores stalking stories told by the survivors in their own words.
Join us every Tuesday as we interview survivors, advocates, and experts to give you a deep dive into the workings of a stalking case.
Would you know where to turn if you or someone you know is being stalked? We'll also give you the resources to fight back, know your rights, and get justice.
Find Strictly Stalking wherever you listen to podcasts from Podcast One.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my Storkosliga co-host, Alice.
Brett, you get like a standing ovation for that one. No idea what you just said, but even if it were homely,
It sounded right.
it would be fine because you said it so beautifully.
It means homely in Icelandic. Actually, it means fantastic, and Maria sent that. Yeah,
Thanks,
I don't know
Maria.
how close it was, but
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it's okay. We don't need to spend a lot of time on superlatives today because I've been chomping at the bit to finish this timeline. Because even as the timeline is going in the Leo Schofield, Michelle Schofield case, you already see a lot of questions popping up. And we can't quite get there until we finish the timeline for now. Because as you said, we're going to do a little something different with the timeline this time.
Yeah, and if you've listened to the past two episodes, if you hadn't, obviously you should. We're walking through this night when Michelle Schofield disappeared and was murdered, and it's been interesting because we've talked about various things that have come up at trial, things that are good for Leo, things that are bad for Leo. We finished up last time with the Laffoons, which is one of those bad things for Leo. It's two eyewitnesses who put two men matching the description, maybe, of Leo and his father, certainly two vehicles matching the description of the Mazda and the truck at the site of where the body was found. And we're going to talk a lot about the Laffoons later. I'm not going to spend time on them right now. But what's really interesting about this timeline, and we sort of, I think, warned you this was going to happen. It's very winding. Like, at times you're like, wow, this is really good for Leo. This seems like it's impossible he could have done this. And then all of a sudden you're jerked back by some witness who sees something that seems like it's incredibly incriminating. But we're at a point where, if you believe Leo, they've been looking for Michelle for quite some time and they haven't been able to find her. And the night is getting old.
And here's the thing about the timeline as we go. You know, we've said this before. A lot of this timeline, there's no external kind of validator of the times. There's no, security camera or some phone record that can validate certain points in the night. And here's another thing about the night. If Leo is doing what he says he's doing, which is driving around town looking for Michelle, there will be a lot of periods of time that are unaccounted for and also that don't fit within a timeline. So just because, say, Buddy Anderson's house is 15 minutes away, it may take him an hour to get there if he's winding down every single street looking for Michelle. And so it could mean that he's doing what he says he's doing, looking for Michelle. But you can imagine someone who's viewing it from another viewpoint thinks, well, if it took him an hour to go somewhere that should have taken 20 minutes or 15 minutes, then he's clearly lying, or he was dumping a body or covering up a murder. So all of these kind of unknowns are built into what's happening and leads to a lot of questions. So the next point in time that we do have is at 4:40 a.m. Leo goes back to the Andersons' house. That's where he started the night, remember, with band practice. At this point, he still has found no trace of Michelle, and he is really worked up. He's upset, he's crying, and Buddy and Leo sit and talk about what to do next. One thing I'd like to note is this is, from what we can tell, Leo really is upset because his friend is still up at 4:40, talking to him, knowing what a big deal this is, as opposed to going to bed, for example. There's someone to talk to at 4:40 in the morning. And when they're talking, Leo tells Buddy that he's worried that whoever has Michelle is going to do something to her, maybe kill her. And according to Buddy's trial testimony, Leo was wearing the same clothes as when he left. And this is really interesting because the thing that, at least from Buddy's testimony, Leo jumps to is that someone has Michelle, or Michelle is with someone, and that someone has nefarious plans for Michelle. I mean, this could even just be a sixth sense. You know, when people are very close to you, you may have that sense that something is horribly wrong. But he voices his greatest fear, which unfortunately turns out to be true, to Buddy at this time. Sometime after 6:30 a.m., after Leo had visited him, David Somm got up and he starts looking for his daughter. And sometime in the early morning, he goes by their trailer and he even goes inside. David looked throughout the trailer, including in Michelle and Leo's bedroom. And he noted the same thing that others are going to note, others who went into the trailer around this time, that it was messy, and the bed lacked sheets. It wasn't like a model of, home economics. But he saw no evidence of blood. If Michelle had been murdered, Leo had already cleaned up any evidence of it, and nothing looked out of place to David. At 10 a.m., Alice Scott, that neighbor who's always watching and watched apparently throughout the night for Michelle and or Leo, says that she sees Leo at the trailer. And at 10:30 that morning, a deputy, John Maney, meets with Leo at his home, and that's when he formally reports Michelle missing. They spend 20 minutes in the living room of the trailer, and after that, Leo and his father and friends continue to search for Michelle in various areas that she might be, just driving all over town, hoping that they stumble across something that will lead them to Michelle. They seem to take her disappearance much more seriously than the police. And around 12:30, Leo Sr. and Leo Jr. go to the police station to file a missing persons report. One thing to note here is that this is now the third, fourth time that Leo Jr. is making intentional contact with the police to try and report Michelle missing. First, it was, the call to the police, swearing out a missing persons report, opening up formal missing persons report, approaching police officers on the street in the middle of the night saying, "Are you looking for her? I previously, filled out a missing person report." Whatever you think about him, he does seem to intentionally be the first mover to contact police on multiple occasions, I think 4 within the first 12 hours of her missing. Now, one thing to note about this formal missing persons report around 12 o'clock that next day, it's not Leo Jr. doing most of the talking, as you may expect, since it's his wife who's missing. it's Leo's father who does most of the talking. And it's been reported that Leo Jr. seemed to be kind of lost, which is why his dad apparently was doing all the talking about Michelle's disappearance.
So there's a lot there to unpack. One thing that I think is worth noting is a lot of this comes out in trial, in testimony. And this case is one of those cases where we've talked about this. Everything the accused does is viewed through a lens of suspicion, where people are judging so much based on, is he talking too much? Is he not talking enough? Is he scared? Is he not scared enough? That kind of thing. We see this a lot. And man, this is like the ultimate example of that. So just the last example that Alice gave, where they go to the police station and Leo seems lost. Well, during trial, that's presented as somehow suspicious of Leo. If Leo was really concerned about his wife, why isn't he talking more about her? But you got to remember, Leo's a really young guy. I mean, he's in his early 20s. His wife was 18. This is a really traumatic experience. He's been up all night. He's been looking for her. I mean, this is assuming he didn't do it. There's a lot of reasons to think he might not be in the best shape to talk to police officers. And one of the reasons they're having to file so many of these is there's some jurisdictional issues that kind of pop up, as always happens, where, like there's the county and the city and the other county and who exactly is dealing with this. And so I think it kind of bounced around a little bit, which is always frustrating. I think it was frustrating for Leo. The other thing people point to that's kind of similar to the loss thing is the fact that he was so concerned about her. We touched on this a little bit before, and Alice mentioned it as well. One thing that I think is worth repeating is Leo was worried about Michelle, really worried about Michelle. Even if you believe the prosecution's theory and believe that Leo murdered Michelle, he was really worried about her before the time that anybody thinks he would have killed her. So I only say that to say it doesn't seem, to me at least, that unusual that he's very worried about her at this late stage. Either he's murdered her, and this is part of his alibi and part of building an alibi, which is what the prosecution pushes, or it's just a continuation of how he felt before, whether it's a sixth sense or whether it's just he knows Michelle and he knows that she's late and he knows that she stays out and he knows that sometimes she's irresponsible, but she's never done anything like this. This is different from the things that have happened in the past. And this is not an incredibly safe area. There had been several girls who had been murdered right in this area, right around this time. And to me, this is one of those things, and there are going to be several days where I'm going to say this, and everybody's entitled to their opinion on how they view this stuff. But this is something that really, I didn't think, man, it's so weird that he's so worried. That comes up so much. If you listen to Bone Valley, you hear it over and over and over again about how weird it was that he was so worried. To me, because it's consistent from before he would have known where she was and before he would have killed her and afterwards, to me, it just doesn't seem that significant.
Yeah, but a couple of things to note on that. So first, on the seeming worried, I do think it's interesting that, you're kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't. If you weren't worried, certainly people would be saying it would be like a Scott Peterson situation where he's at a wake, for his missing wife, calling a mistress, and people are thinking, how callous can you be? Here, he's clearly so worried that I also wonder, there are a couple theories of if Leo, it may have been that he was so worried about her, got really angry and hadn't premeditated this murder, but saw her, found her, and then got so mad because he'd been so worried that he then killed her. A couple things to know. He does seem to be worried about her in a way that is unlike other times when she is late, right? I think that's why all of the family members are involved. That's why his sister keeps looking at the time. That's why the Andersons, everyone's kind of getting involved in this search, which is not typical of when she's late in the past. And everyone reacts differently, and certainly when emotions are running high, you don't know how certain people will act. But typically, when you are deeply concerned about someone and not just annoyed with them, the response to your worst fears not coming true is relief rather than blind rage, murderous rage, right? And so if that theory were playing out to be true, that he really was worried about her, so relieved he found her, but really angry that she made him so angry and then murdered her, you would think there'd be some change in the way that he acted in terms of his worry from before to after. What we see in this timeline throughout the night, at least He might be a very good actor, but his level of worry kind of seems the same. It doesn't seem like in between something has changed. And with respect to him not speaking, because this is another point that you hear in Bone Valley, for example, people harp on a lot, is that when they swear out that missing persons report at noon the next day, that it's his dad talking, how weird is it that his dad is talking, that he doesn't even know his wife's birthday, that sort of thing. Remember, we're all focusing on one situation, one instance where he wasn't doing the talking with police. But what we see is just like an hour earlier, he'd been having an interview with a police officer in his own living room. He had been the one to approach the police in 2 previous instances in the night to report Michelle missing. At some point, from his perspective, he's spoken to police on his own volition 3 times, and he had to make them care about something he deeply cared about. On the 4th time, we see this a lot where people are like, I've talked to everyone. I keep calling the stupid hotlines you guys tell me to call. Finally, now you're telling me you're listening. Okay, whatever. And we've had witnesses who don't believe us that we're really listening. We're really taking notes. You reached the right person. He may be done talking. I mean, he may be so like, what's the point? I've already said this 3 times. Don't you guys all know? And a lot of lay people think all police officers are the same. If you tell one police officer, then everybody knows that we have some database that all law enforcement knows everything. So part of it might even just be a feeling of helplessness. I've already told you, you know this information. What more do you need from me? So I don't read that much into the fact that by 12:30, after he hasn't slept all night, he's been contacting police throughout the night, that now he isn't talking. If he didn't talk any of those other times, I think it might be more noteworthy. But I just keep this timeline in mind that he's been talking. An hour earlier was being interviewed by a police officer in his own living room. Now he's letting his dad talk.
We often point this stuff out because I don't think look, he may be guilty. We may say he's guilty. It's kind of like Scott Peterson. There's so much focus on like what Scott Peterson said in this interview or that interview. And to me, I just don't care about that. You know, I care about sort of the actual evidence that he's guilty. And there's so much focus on, you know, the way Leo Schofield acts. And you hear this, Bone Valley does a really good job of interviewing the police officers and the detectives, and they will say things like this. Well, yeah, I mean, Alice mentioned the birthday. Oh, it's weird that he didn't remember his wife's birthday. Okay. He's in a super stressful situation. I was in the CVS yesterday picking up medicine for my wife and my son, and they asked me my son's birthday, and I was like, and it took me a second, and I wasn't in a stressful situation. And it's like, you're really going to say a guy murdered somebody because when he was at the police station reporting his wife missing, he couldn't remember the exact year that she was born when she's a couple years younger than him? I mean, come on. Anyways, now, one thing that is more significant and is a mystery, and Alice touched on this as well when she was going through the timeline. As we're going to learn, this was a brutal murder, and it is a big part of the prosecution's theory, based a lot on what Alice Scott said she saw, that this murder took place in that trailer. And you've got David Somm sort of showing up very early in the morning, looking around this trailer, and he sees some stuff that's weird, like the lack of sheets. You can imagine where that's going to go. Like maybe he used the sheets to carry her body out. That's what Alice Scott was seeing. But what he doesn't see is a lot of blood. In fact, he doesn't see any blood. And there are going to be police officers in and out of this house, and they're not going to see a lot of blood either. And there are going to be crime scene technicians who come in. And spoiler alert, they're not going to find a lot of blood either. And there's sort of this mystery in this case. If Michelle Schofield was murdered in that trailer, why is nobody seeing any blood? Now, one thing the prosecution puts forward to explain that is what happens next in the timeline. Sometime later in that day, Alice Scott is going to say, and she'll testify to this, that she saw Leo with a carpet cleaner. So the idea is Leo murders Michelle. Well, he's got the carpet cleaner. And in fact, his father will testify that Leo did have a carpet cleaner, that they had borrowed it earlier from his landlord, and that Leo and his father would return it together. Leo had just gotten a new puppy, and the puppy was not doing a great job. So I think the idea was the reason they initially had it, whether it cleaned up blood later on or not, was to clean up the trailer from that problem. So Leo Sr. mentions this. On cross-examination, the prosecution will note that until he took the stand, he had never mentioned the carpet cleaner. This is something you see a lot, both in this case and a lot of cases, where people will say something on the stand they've never told the police. And the obvious cross-examination technique is to point out, like, well, why didn't you ever mention this to the police before? Why is the first time we're hearing about this in trial? To me, I don't know. Doesn't seem necessarily like a bad thing for the prosecution to confirm Alice Scott's story that there was a carpet cleaner. The problem with this, and what's interesting, is whatever's going on with a carpet cleaner, even if Alice Scott's telling the truth, and even if Leo had the carpet cleaner and all that, he's already too late. David Somm, as we said, has already been to the trailer and gone through it. If Leo was cleaning at this late hour, surely David, who had gone into the bedroom, would have seen what he's trying to clean up, unless it's a very small amount of blood in sort of a not obvious area. And of course, David wasn't alone in that. You also had this officer who'd come by the house. Now, he didn't go in the bedroom, but he was in the living room, and he doesn't report seeing any obvious blood either. And remember, if your theory is that Michelle was killed in the bedroom, he's going to have to take her through that living room. Wherever she died, there's going to be blood, and you would expect that there would be some blood in the sort of transport of her body. And we're not seeing a lot of that, and that's a little bit of a mystery. And I think the prosecution does a pretty good job at trial of using this carpet cleaner to stand in for an explanation for the jury. Kind of reminds me of Temujin Kinsu in The Plane Flight. So you have Kinsu, who has a great alibi, has a whole lot of people supporting his alibi. Doesn't seem like there's any way he could have gotten there. And the prosecution comes up with a theory that he rented a plane. Don't really have any proof that he did that, but they put it on anyway on rebuttal. They put a pilot on. He says, oh yeah, you could rent a plane. And if you did that, you could fly down. And that was sort of, that allowed the jury to say, aha, well, then maybe that alibi isn't as significant. I feel like here, the prosecution has a blood problem, and the way they kind of get around it is they point to this carpet cleaner. Maybe Leo did a really good job of cleaning up this crime scene.
So with the carpet cleaning, I think this is really interesting because those 4 instances where the police, except for, I guess, when the police officer comes over to the trailer, I don't know who initiated that. But because Leo can control when he's going to the police to file the missing persons report, you would think if he wants to clean up any blood, he would clean up the blood and wait to go file the missing persons report. But if you look at this timeline, he is going to file the missing persons report on multiple occasions, all before Alice Scott reports seeing him with a carpet cleaner, which just seems a little bit, flipped on its head if what he was trying to do was to cover up what was happening in the trailer. And I think that's really important here. Yes, when you hear carpet cleaner, alarm bells start going off in your head, and the prosecution absolutely seizes on that. But that timeline is really important, as Brett says. So many people have walked into that trailer, and specifically, what did they see? Let's say that Alice Scott got her timeline wrong, and there was a carpet cleaner, but she was wrong. It was earlier in the day before anyone had entered. You would imagine someone who has spent time cleaning up all traces of blood, even if your apartment is messy or your trailer is messy, you have to clear things out of the way in order to make sure you get all of it, especially if you already have a messy trailer. If there's clothes kind of strewn about, you would either throw away all the clothes because you don't know what's splattered onto the clothes and you can't necessarily carpet steam all of the blood out of the clothes, or at the very least, you would move all the stuff out of the way so that you could reach the floor. So all the debris, all of the trash, all of the messy stuff you have in your house to one side so that you can clean the carpet. And I guess if you had enough foresight, you would then move all that mess back onto the carpet. But you would notice that maybe it doesn't look the way a messy apartment should. And David Somm had been in that trailer many times before, and he didn't say anything was strange, except that it was messy. And the fact that it was messy says something to me. Says that it was unlikely that it was cleaned underneath and then re-messed up, because there's just not enough time. And also, that's a level of thinking that a lot of people forget. Because we will see crime scene photos where someone's tried to cover up something. Actually, this is one of my favorite suppression hearings, because someone was saying that the gun wasn't where it was found. And it was like so obvious that this one part of a very, very messy apartment was like so clean. Like it was as if someone took a magic eraser on the floor and just like wiped away everything. On this side of the floor, it was like broken beer bottles and like gross, dirty syringes and literal trash on the floor and clothes. And then on the other side of the photo of the apartment, it was like clean as a whistle because they had cleaned out all the drugs and like all the guns on that side when the police were coming in for the search warrant. And it just looked so stark on that picture. We have no reports of something looking like that here. Again, he may be a mastermind, cleaned everything and then put it on. But I think if he were to so effectively clean the blood off with a carpet cleaner, he would have had to account for all the mess that was everywhere that everyone's reporting is the state of their home normally, and either throw all that stuff away, in which case, where does the mess come back? Or somehow the mess didn't get any of the blood on it, and he was able to re-mess up the apartment.
Yeah, the house being clean would have been more suspicious to me than the house being messy. The house being messy is not suspicious to me. And we'll talk more about the sheets later. So that's Wednesday, and sort of everybody's looking for Michelle. And really, they have been looking for her since late Tuesday night, throughout the night Tuesday. They look for her all day Wednesday. They don't find her, and they don't find the car. But then on Thursday, one of Leo's friends is driving down the road, and what does he see? He sees the Mazda, Michelle's car, parked on the side of the I-4 interstate. I-4 sort of bisects the area that we've been talking about. Essentially, all Leo's house, Tom's restaurant where she worked, Sparky's, David Som's house, all of that is south down. Keep going southward. If you want to find the Andersons' house and Vince Rayner's house and Leo's parents' house, that's a little bit north and west of I-4. And when they're looking for Michelle, they've been looking for her basically between Sparky's, which is where that payphone was and where they think that she made this phone call, and Vince's, where she was going to go. That's been their sort of search area, looking for her. And then all of a sudden, they get this call that the car's been found, but it's been found sort of northeast on I-4, going away from everything we've been talking about. Michelle's car is on this interstate, sort of going away from the areas that matter. If you're watching on YouTube, got a map up, you'll see this now. So anyways, so he finds this car. He calls Leo. Leo goes out to the scene, and after he sees the car, he actually climbs up a hill to sort of an exit ramp to a convenience store and calls the police. The police show up. The car is locked except for the hatchback. So this car has a hatchback in the back. That part is unlocked. The rest is locked. The hatchback has, when you open it up, something interesting about it. The speakers and the power booster have been stolen from the car. This is the 80s, stealing stereos. Back in the 80s, those of you who are alive back then, it was pretty popular. And I remember they used to have those little plates, or you had like removable radio plates. You could take them off so people couldn't steal your radio. This was, I don't know what was going on in the 80s. We also had what was that thing that you put on your steering wheel to keep people from
like a
the
club.
Yeah, they called it the club.
I had friends who would like take their radio, whatever sound system out and like took it with them when they left the car so it couldn't be stolen.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing. So they find her car and voila, something's been stolen from the car. Police show up and they also notice the car is still in gear. And the tow truck guy, he releases the brake. He's trying to get it out of gear, but he never could do it. And the state of the car also becomes a little bit of a mystery. Why is it in gear? Why is it parked on the side of I-4 the way it is? It is about 7 miles away from where Michelle's body will be eventually found. And look, the fact that this is a friend who found Michelle's car, and while it's a few miles away from where Michelle's body will be found, and like I said, it's away from sort of the general search area that the family's undergoing, note that the police didn't find it. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, the police don't really take this seriously, maybe up until this point. The police think 18-year-old newlyweds, she's off on some, that's what they think's happened. She's gone off with a boyfriend, whatever, she'll turn up. They don't put many resources into this. And if the friend hadn't found the car, who knows how long it would have taken for somebody driving down I-4 to notice this car and report it in.
Yeah, I do think this is really interesting because I-4 is an interstate, and it's just, even if the search party is not going out in this direction, you would think that there's police going down the interstates at all times, even if it's not their jurisdiction, they're going to the next jurisdiction. And I would think an orange Nissan is kind of something that is be on the lookout for all police. And it's so strange that no one saw this very distinctive looking car on the side of the road for days. One thing that I just don't understand, maybe it's something you can explain to me because you understand a lot of things, especially from the 80s. What does it mean when they say that the car was found in gear? I know it means it wasn't in park, but what does it mean? Well, the part that gets me confused is that clearly something happened and the car stalled, but what does it mean that the tow truck people couldn't release the car even when they took the brakes off? Do you know what that means? That's something that
So we're going to spend a lot of time on the car and its state, but essentially it's in drive and they just can't get it out of drive into park. And apparently whoever's driving it at the time couldn't get it out of drive into park. The car has some serious issues. Whoever did this did not decide to dump the car here. Whatever happened, the person who was driving this car had to pull over and stop the car. And there's going to be a technician who will testify about this. We're going to talk a lot about it. So don't you worry, Alice. We're going to spend some time on this vehicle.
I mean, I would just tell you, like, I have a lot of, this is also interesting because you're right about that. Something malfunctioned with the car. The fact that it's not in park says that. How it malfunctioned, when it malfunctioned, and how much it could still be driven, because it obviously has something to do with Michelle's disappearance, I think says a lot about whether Leo could have done it or not, and kind of what the motivations are if it wasn't Leo. So anyway, little spoiler there, but that is something I have fixated on, and I look forward to hearing more about it. So that was on Thursday when Michelle's car is spotted, but remember, the car's locked and Michelle's not in it. So they continue to look, and they're thinking Michelle's body has got to be close, but they find nothing on Thursday. It's not until Friday, February 27th, that Michelle's body is found, and it confirms everyone's worst suspicions. She's not just off having fun. She didn't just run away to go party with some friends. She had been met with a terrible fate. Her body is found in a canal off of State Road 33 near the intersection with I-4. She is fully clothed, and her body, strangely, is under a board and some brush. It's almost like someone wanted to conceal her body. She's not wearing any shoes, though, and she does not have a wallet or purse. And upon examination, it becomes clear that this was not an accident at all. Michelle had been stabbed to death. And there are drag marks that lead to the body, and loose change is strewn along the drag path. This was something that was very physical. A deputy who testified at trial said that there was, quote, apparent blood in the dirt. And this area of blood is about just 27 feet from the canal. Most of the change was there as well, but the drag marks actually start several feet from the blood, as much as 19 feet away. A note on this blood, and there's more to come on where this blood is. As you all know, your blood pumps when your heart is pumping. So there's some level of having just been murdered or your heart is still pumping, that there's that amount of blood that you can still see it on the dirt, 4 days later from her disappearance. So if she had been murdered elsewhere and then taken here, but she was already dead at that point, it's unlikely we'd be seeing this amount of blood in the dirt. Now, Michelle's ring is still on her finger, and the blood in the dirt is confirmed to be Michelle's. And we know that there's a lot of it. And that's really interesting because, as we know, the ground soaks up liquids. And so for the forensic analyst to know that there's a lot of blood, it has to be a lot of blood here, which kind of cuts against the whole being murdered back at the trailer, which is several miles away, and then being brought here still alive enough to be pumping blood, to have a lot of her blood be spilled out onto the ground just feet away from where she's ultimately found. Now, there are circumstances of her body being found that are unusual. So you heard earlier that it was one of Leo's friends that spotted the Nissan and called Leo, but they still didn't find the body. So even with the location of the car, now people are searching around where the car is found, and they still can't find her until Leo's father finds her. And strangely, he will tell the story that gets repeated over and over, and it has come to bite him in the behind multiple times. He tells people that finding Michelle was divinely inspired. He says that he had a dream and he was told that her body was here. That's obviously suspect because she's been searched for days at this point. Police are looking for her, friends are looking for her, and no one's been able to find her. We've told you this before. If you find a dead body, you're automatically going to be high on the list of potential perpetrators because you knew where to find the body. You may be cleared, but statistics are you're going to be on that list, especially when you then start telling a story that seems very strange. And in Bone Valley, you'll hear, interviews with the police officers who heard this story from Leo Sr., and they say that it gave him chills, that he somehow got a message from God where Michelle's body was. So with Michelle's body found, the case doesn't really go anywhere, kind of flounders. It just meanders. Leo takes and fails a polygraph test. Polygraph tests, as you all know, is not really a lie detector. It is a biometric measure of different things in your body, like your breath, your temperature, things that could be indicators of stress or lying. Not admissible in court, but they're often used in investigations. Leo takes it. Take it for what it's worth. He fails that polygraph test. Eventually, the prosecutor on the case, John Aguero, becomes convinced that either Leo's father, or some combination of the two of them are responsible for Michelle's death. Now, at this point, Leo Jr. has moved back to Massachusetts. Aguero indicts Leo, and Leo's arrested and brought back to Florida for trial. And Leo Jr., he says, nope, I don't want a public defender. I'm going to hire a local legend, Jack Edmonds, to defend me. And that brings us to trial. Prosecutors.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Spent a lot of time on this in Bone Valley about Jack Edmonds and the public defender. It's actually a really good example of what we've said before about how awesome public defenders are. And if you're in trouble, having a public defender is not necessarily a bad thing. Bone Valley goes all in on that. The public defenders would have been great, and they would have really been focused. Whereas Jack Edmonds, he's a big shot. It's not like he has to make his career on Leo, right? And there's some real indications that just the way he tried cases, he was very effective. He won a lot of cases. And the way he did it was through charisma. And honestly, if you're guilty, that's what you want. You want somebody like Jack Edmonds who's going to walk in, he's going to tear apart the prosecution witnesses, he's going to sort of mystify the jury and convince them to find you not guilty. If you are innocent, if you're not guilty, you really need a lawyer who can absorb the evidence, really think about it, kind of in the way that we're doing, and point out how the prosecution's theory doesn't make any sense. And I think the unfortunate thing for Leo, if he's innocent, is he hired the lawyer you need when you're guilty, not the one you need when you're innocent. And you see that if you read the transcript of the trial. Jack Edmonds is not ineffective. You know, Leo's going to be convicted. We've already told you that. On his habeas petition, he's going to make claims of ineffective assistance counsel based on some things that Jack Edmonds did. Jack Edmonds is going to say, yeah, I was ineffective, which a lot of lawyers will do that. They kind of fall on their sword because there is literally no downside to being found ineffective as a defense attorney. People ask that sometimes. No downside. So if he's found ineffective, great for his client. Now, usually, just because you like your professional reputation, you're not going to say you're ineffective, though I've seen it happen. I've had a lawyer on the stand who just threw his hands up and started saying, I was ineffective. And that made for an interesting appeal. But so he's going to do that, but he's not going to be found ineffective because he's going to do a lot of things that are good. But there are lots of things about this prosecution case where there were weaknesses that could have been exposed that weren't exposed. Hopefully you'll see that as we go through the evidence. Now, there's a lot of good evidence against Leo. And there's evidence that makes Leo look really bad. That's where we're going to start because it's where the prosecution started, their entire theory of the case. And I'll just go ahead and tell you, by the time we finish with this section, there's a lot of you who are not going to like Leo very much. You're going to have a very negative opinion of him. And that's exactly what the prosecution was banking on. They started their case basically painting Leo as a violent young man who had a lot of anger issues and could not control himself. And the prosecutor, John Aguero, was a very good prosecutor, and he's going to present this relationship between Leo and Michelle as a volatile, violent one, just riven by domestic abuse. And to support this, he's going to put on witnesses, a lot of them, more than a dozen witnesses who are going to testify about Leo and Michelle's relationship. They're going to testify that Michelle and Leo fought almost daily, that Leo would trash the trailer, he was overturning furniture, he's throwing clothes and objects all over the place. Now, before we get into these people and what they're going to say, I think that we're all, we all have this, right? We all have our internal biases. And I think when you listen to Bone Valley, you're going to like Leo. And because you like him and you hear his voice and you hear what he says and you become sympathetic to him, you really buy into the idea that this is unfair, that this is, they are trying him as he may be abusive, but that doesn't make him a murderer. And why is all this relevant? Well, the courts, this is all 404B evidence. They're back to 404B, our favorite rule. And as we've told you before, you cannot convict someone for being a bad person. You have to convict them for committing a crime. But the courts have analyzed what is evidence that they committed the crime. And one of the things they've said is in abusive domestic violence type relationships, a history of domestic violence is relevant and is admissible and goes to the heart of the case. So if you murder some random person and you're somebody who beats your wife, the fact that you beat your wife probably won't come in to the fact that you murdered this person. But if you murder your wife, it will. And I think most people in a scenario where you're not talking about Leo Schofield or you're not talking about someone you know, agree with that. I think most of us, if you heard about a case where an abusive husband went to trial for murdering his wife and the judge would not let the prosecution tell the jury that every night he was beating and strangling and doing all sorts of awful things to her, a lot of you would be outraged. You wouldn't understand why that is, and neither would I, because that should be admissible. But then when it's about Leo, all of a sudden it becomes unfair. Now, I will say this, 404 evidence should come in, but there is a balance. And one of them is at some point, evidence becomes more prejudicial than it's probative. That's Rule 403. And it can be because it's cumulative. I think there's a pretty good argument that over a dozen witnesses was overkill, that this was too much. But the thing is, and this goes into sort of where Jack Edmonds should have been more aggressive, that's on the defense. The prosecution, if they have admissible evidence, they can decide to put it all on. Now, they may not. Alice and I have been in situations where we have not put on witnesses who we thought would be good witnesses because we knew the trial was going long. We thought the jury got it. We were worried that they might be bored. We didn't want to, all sorts of reasons, right? So you don't put it on. So maybe if you have 18 witnesses who can testify domestic violence, you only put on 6 as part of your trial strategy. But if it's admissible, there's nothing wrong with you admitting it. And it's on the defense to try and stop it. And it doesn't seem like there was ever any effort to stop this evidence from coming in.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would have objected on each one as inadmissible, because some of you may be thinking, well, what's the big deal? It's the same information that's being heard over and over again. But the thing is, when you are told the same thing over and over, you begin to think it's true. And you'll often see defense want to call the same number of witnesses, which they almost always cannot, because the prosecution has the burden to prove something. Is you'll see they try to have, a number of witnesses just to look like the balance sheet is on there. So I would have fought tooth and nail here to keep out certain amount, or even reach an agreement on the side outside of court with the prosecution. Like, we can even agree that there are 12 people who will testify to this. Let's just hear from 6. Because even if the jury knows there are 12 people who can testify to this information, you only hear from 6. That's only 6 testimonies that you hear, because each one is going to have its impact, a different impact, because it's from a different point of view on the jurors who are listening.
Now, we're going to go through some of them. We're not even going to go through all of them, because frankly, this part of the transcript got boring to me. It was where it got very repetitive, because basically, and you're going to see some of this is eyewitness testimony of things happening. Some of it's very speculative. There's also, I can't tell you whether or not this testimony is true or not. I can't tell you whether any of this happened. We're going to tell you what Leo says about it after we tell you what they say. I do feel like in this case, and you're going to see this a couple times, the thing about witness testimony is people, what they remember is not necessarily what happened. And their memory may be clouded by things that happened afterwards. So imagine a scenario where you're in a room with 2 people who get in a fight, getting a verbal altercation. They're screaming at each other. And then later on, one of them ends up dead, and you're called to testify about that. You may remember that being even more volatile than it was, and I think you're going to see that a couple times where you kind of wonder exactly what's going on here. And is all this true? I don't think there's any question that this was a volatile relationship. And I don't think there's any question that Leo was violent and that he was violent with Michelle. Some of the stuff that we hear, I just don't know if things went down exactly the way people said they did. But let's give it to you so you know. But just to prepare you, when we finish with this, you're probably not going to like Leo very much. So the prosecution lays this out. They call Bobby Levins, and he actually lived with his girlfriend Mary and the Schofields for 3 months. Remember, the Schofields, Leo, Michelle, they didn't have a lot of money. And so they tried to sort of offset the fact that they didn't have a lot of money by having roommates. So they have roommates in this sort of small trailer. That was not the perfect situation. It caused a lot of stress and a lot of tension. And Leo talks about this too. But these people are there witnessing this relationship. And Bobby would testify that Leo definitely had a temper. Bobby would go off to work and he would come home and he'd find furniture upside down. He'd find windows busted out. Now, he said he never saw Leo hit Michelle, but what he did see, and you hear this again and again, he would hear them arguing in the back of the trailer, and he would hear what he thought was a slapping sound, and then he would hear Michelle crying. So he sort of extrapolates this to be, something's going on. Now, he can testify to all those things. You might be thinking he's speculating about what's going on back there. But once again, circumstantial evidence. You hear people yelling, you hear a slapping sound, you hear a woman crying. You can deduce what is probably going on. Mary, she had been friends with Michelle for many years. Leo did not like her at all. And you can tell from the testimony that Mary didn't like Leo either. And she would describe him as dominating Michelle. She also never saw Leo hit Michelle, but she did hear him slap her. And you hear this a lot. A lot of people hear the fighting going on, but they don't necessarily see it. Mary said that Leo once got mad at her for having her feet on the coffee table, and so he flipped it over, spilling plants and dirts all over the room. This was the kind of thing that tended to happen. Now, one thing Mary did say on cross-examination is that Leo tended to take his anger out on inanimate objects, not on other people.
So you can see that there's a lot of tension between these people to begin with. And this is one of those things that falls right into the category of after the fact. We now know one of these 2 people who had very loud and volatile fights. One of them is now dead. So the fact that you hear slapping, again, that's all speculation, who was slapping whom, or if anyone was being slapped, or if it was walls, furniture, etc. But what you can tell from this is this is not the seemingly honeymoon phase. They've been married a very short amount of time. They're not even married 1 year before Michelle is murdered. And so there's no like honeymoon period that's worn off. This is their relationship. And objectively, it's violent in the sense that furniture's getting flipped. And even if you take out anger on inanimate objects, that's still an externalization of your emotions. Now, there's someone else who lives with the Schofields who's called by the state, and that's Dean Fletcher. He comes to trial and he testifies that he actually witnessed Leo punch Michelle in the stomach hard enough to bring Michelle to her knees when she brought him tea in the wrong glass. Dean testified that Leo would get particularly mad when Michelle didn't come home when she should, or when she wouldn't tell Leo where she had been. Dean's girlfriend would testify about a time that Leo headbutted Michelle. Leo will claim that this was an accident, but no, he doesn't deny that his head touches Michelle's head. But what Dean's girlfriend sees is an intentional headbutting by Leo. And she said that actually knocked Michelle out. And it was such a bad hit that Michelle not only was unconscious, but she started to turn colors as if she was dying. And so they called an ambulance. Now, it doesn't stop there. She also heard Leo say that if he didn't stop himself, he'd end up killing Michelle. Now that, you can imagine, is something that could be said by many people who never intend to kill anyone. But put that in conjunction with at least 2 situations where they've witnessed physical altercations where Leo is the aggressor, is a lot more serious. And neither of these 2 events can really be easily explained away unless these witnesses somehow missaw. They were mistaken. They didn't actually see it. The punch to the stomach for something as small as giving him the wrong tea glass seems pretty irrational. And the headbutting, again, the fact that Leo doesn't deny that a headbutting happened, just the intent behind it, is also very suspect, because when you have a headbutting incident, if it were an accident, it seems as it wouldn't be so bad as to knock someone out. And this is a couple who fights bad enough where ambulances are called. This is not just some private domestic affair, but they're bold enough at least to have these fights in the presence of others. Sure, it may just be because they have to live with other people and they can't contain kind of their fights to when they're alone, because they're never alone. But the fact that there are lots of other witnesses to their volatile relationship, I think goes to the fact of what Brett already said. I think Leo is a violent person. He is an angry person, and they do have a volatile relationship. Does that necessarily mean what happens to Michelle was at the hands of Leo? No. But this is all very relevant, and that's why the state starts here, and it's effective. Leo is not coming off good at all. And it's not just those witnesses who see physical altercations between Leo and Michelle. Ricky Scott takes the stand and testified that he'd seen Leo drag Michelle out of her car by her hair.
And look, I mean, this is effective because, number one, it shows violence against Michelle, but it also is conditioning the jury. The jury, every time you guys listen to a case, when we do a case that's controversial, we always present evidence to you, and oftentimes we'll present evidence that could be interpreted one of 2 ways. It could be bad for the defendant, could be good for the defendant, depending on how you look at it. This is conditioning the jury to, when they have those decisions, to assume the worst about Leo, right? It is very effective. Arguably, the prosecution had won this case by the time this testimony ended. The jury was already primed to believe that this young woman is dead. Her husband was really violent. He'd been violent with her before. He'd been violent with her before in situations that are kind of similar to what we're seeing here. Remember the prosecution's theory. Leo comes upon her at some point after being so concerned about her when she's been gone all night. And he loses his mind, and they get home, the whole dragging her into the trailer by her hair. You can imagine the jury seeing that in their mind the night of the murder. So yes, this is very effective, and it's not great for Leo, and it just continues. I mean, this is just sort of over and over and over again. Michelle McCluskey is also going to testify. Michelle was our Michelle's best friend, and she was also a close friend to Leo as well. And she testified, and her testimony is particularly damning. She testified that she witnessed Leo hit Michelle on more than one occasion. She also testified that during one of their fights, she heard him yell, "Shut up, I hate you, I'll kill you, you bitch." Now, her testimony was much more intense than earlier reports. This is another thing that you see a lot in this case. When she initially talked to police and gave them a statement, she said that Leo, quote, might have hit Michelle once before. Not that once is too much, right? But compare that to what she's saying at trial. She's much more aggressive in what she remembers happening when she's talking in front of the jury. She has other damning testimony. She testifies that after the murders, Leo was standing in her driveway and said that he could have murdered Michelle and not remembered it, that maybe he blacked out and didn't even remember. Obviously, she found this to be very disturbing. Now, Leo has a different story, and he's going to testify to it. He says that he and his friends were together, and one of them asked him if there was any way he could have blacked out and killed Michelle, and that Leo said, no, there's no way that could happen. And once again, this just goes back to memory and why people say the things they do, and are they lying intentionally, even if what they tell is not correct. And maybe Michelle's telling the God's honest truth, and Leo said that. But it's very easy to imagine how Michelle, through the lens of, I am now convinced that Leo killed my best friend, remembers this conversation going differently than it actually did. And remembers Leo being the one who says that, not having it presented to him. And this is why, as we've said many times, I mean, people, they always want to talk about how, oh, this is just a circumstantial case. This is just a, if only we had witnesses who could testify. Their witnesses are terrible. I mean, memory is so fallible. And like I said, she could be remembering exactly what happened, but Leo's story is pretty plausible. And it's just not hard to imagine if she heard that, her transposing that. Now, her saying that she saw Leo hit Michelle on multiple occasions, that being so different from what she told the police, it could be that initially she really believed Leo was innocent and she didn't want to paint him in a bad light. And she didn't want the police to think Leo did it when he didn't do it. So she softened it, and she didn't say how violent Leo had been. That's another possibility you have to consider.
And, a lot happens before you go to trial, but once people are sitting in trial, and even though people are innocent until proven guilty, the fact that she's testifying on behalf of the state, and this is her best friend, whoever killed her, that person has robbed her of her best friend. There are a lot of emotions and personal, kind of life wrapped up in this testimony. And at the point where she has been prepped by the prosecution, is on the stand testifying for the prosecution against who she thinks is the murder of her best friend. You can imagine that she's not trying to lie or misremember a conversation, but rather probably has confirmation bias in her own mind. And at that time, when this conversation was happening, may have thought, I can't believe you killed my best friend, and heard what her brain thought she was supposed to hear. This is kind of like when you finish people's sentences, when you think you know what they're going to say, so you finish their sentence, and in fact, they were going to go a completely different route. You weren't lying or trying to misstate what they were saying. You just thought you knew where it was going, so your brain was filling in the blanks faster than the other person was speaking. That may have happened here. So I say that just to show how fine a line it is to jump to, oh, witnesses are lying. I've said this many times before, and I still stand by it. My first thing is I do not jump to a witness is lying, because your brain does so many different things, especially when you have a narrative in your head and you have other circumstantial evidence that would fit a particular narrative. Your brain starts to look for supporting facts for your narrative as well here. And this is just hard to know what was actually said. Obviously, we know that Leo's not going to get on the stand and say, yeah, I said that, right? I mean, it just feels like you would not get on the stand and say, I definitely told Michelle's best friend I could have killed her. And I may have. I don't know. That's not his defense. So this is hard to suss out here. But Michelle has more to say, because sometime after the murder, Leo took Michelle to the spot where his wife's body was found, even though, according to Michelle at least, he'd never been there before because the police would not allow him to enter the crime scene. Now, in cross-examination, it was suggested that Leo's father had told him where the body was found, and that's how Leo Jr. knew where to go. And in fact, there was orange tape marking off where Michelle Schofield's body was found, which Leo would have seen. Now, this kind of testimony continued for some time. The prosecution began its case by attempting to prove that Leo was this jealous, violent, volatile, abusive man who terrorized his wife, Michelle, during the short time that they were together. Now, that doesn't make him a murderer, as we've already said, but it certainly does not look good for him, and it is not making any of the jurors like Leo or make them want to believe that he's an innocent man here. This is kind of why 404B exists typically, right? When you think someone's really bad, the fear is the jurors don't know if that person really committed the crime that they're being charged for, but who cares? They're such a bad person. If they're convicted here, I'm not going to lose sleep at night because there's something bad that he did. And if it's not this exact crime, who cares? There's 100 other things that he did really bad against this victim. So, no lost sleep, no injustice if they're convicted. That's what 404B is trying to protect against, because our justice system does not allow that. You don't get convicted because you're a scumbag, even a scumbag to the victim. You have to be guilty of the crime as charged. But as Brett said here, we're hearing all this background and it's relevant for this particular crime. And all of these things, a lot of them are uncontested or incontestable and they're just out there. And there's so many different witnesses. It seems pretty clear that he is this violent person towards Michelle. Now, when all these people are testifying against Leo, you obviously do not have to take the stand in your own defense when you are criminally charged. You can plead the fifth. You don't have to take the stand at all. And there is a jury instruction given by the judge if the defendant does not testify that says, do not read into anything the fact that the defendant has not testified. But with this kind of a setup by the state, Leo almost doesn't have a choice but to testify on his own behalf, especially because he is claiming that he's innocent of murdering his wife. And that's exactly what he does. Leo testifies in his own defense. And when he did, he owns up to some of his actions, some of what the state has put on about his violent relationship. He admitted that slapping Michelle once, that he slapped Michelle once before they were married. And after that, he claimed he never touched her physically. He'd never beat her. But he did admit to slapping her again, this time in the car. And he also admitted to kicking her in the rear end, though he said that was just a playful thing. It wasn't anything violent or aggressive. But you can imagine the jury having heard the setup of all of these violent altercations and then hearing Leo admit to actions that don't sound playful. It's not looking good for Leo.
And this is, why do you not want to testify? Why do you not want your defendant to testify? So Leo, imagine the situation he's in. He could get on the stand and be drawn into every single thing he ever did to her. Like, let's say he was honest, completely honest, and admitted every time he hit her, every time they got in a fight, every time he slapped her. We'd relive those 12 witnesses or 18, however many there are witnesses again, but this time out of his mouth. And just imagine how terrible that testimony is going to be. He sort of takes the position of minimizing things. Well, okay, I slapped her once before. It's not like I beat her. Okay, I might have slapped her in the car. I did this thing. Well, what's the jury going to think? He's lying. He did more than that. And this goes back to sort of our whole, just because you lie, you're not a liar. I think he's absolutely minimizing the violence in that relationship. He's doing it because he doesn't want the jury, if he's innocent. Frankly, if he's innocent or guilty, he's doing it because he doesn't want the jury to think, wow, he's violent. He must have killed her. This is not rocket science, right? It's usually pretty easy to figure out why somebody's lying and what the purpose of their lie is. And I just think this made him look really bad to the jury because I'll tell you, the other thing to remember about this is the 80s. Society's views have changed a lot. I'm not going to say that it was acceptable to be like this in the 80s. I don't necessarily think it was, but it was more accepted. People saw it. These people didn't call the police. These people didn't try and get Michelle help. They might have thought, wow, that's Leo, man. He needs to quit doing that. But they didn't, they didn't take additional steps because, frankly, this was far more common I think, at least seemingly socially accepted common. It may still happen, but I think it happens more behind closed doors now. I think people now know that they can't do that kind of stuff, and people see it and not react in a really bad way. But back then, people did. And I can remember, I grew up in a relatively poor area with a lot of families who had a lot of issues, a lot of domestic violence. It was just something that happened and that you knew about. And I think the jury would know that. The jury doesn't believe him. The jury's thinking, of course you did that. And I think that was really bad for him. I think it really hurt him.
And I want to also note, so I don't know if it was more accepted in the 80s. I'd like to believe it wasn't. I grew up more in the 90s, so I won't speak to that. But one thing I do want to note, all of these friends who are testifying against him, they're also young. They are so young. They are like children. So even if you all who came of age in the 80s are saying, no, this was not as accepted in the 80s, or this type of violence would not have been okay. Think about what you thought was okay or not okay in high school. I mean, they're much closer to high school than they are full-blown adults who are, we think of as being married and on their own. They are essentially children. The reason they're getting mad at each other all the time is Michelle likes to be a teenager. She likes to go and party with her friends and have a good time. And Leo is kind of a jealous guy because Michelle is good looking, and he does not like that his wife, whether it's because he loves her or wants to control her, is out having a good time with other people, other men, not him. And the people that they're around are also similarly situated. They haven't, lived decades of life and know how to respond in these situations. And there's probably an element, especially when you're living, in close proximity with each other. These are roommates who are testifying to this. If you call the cops on your own roommates, and this is something that happens all the time, it's probably going to continue to happen all the time, and you can't call the cops every single day. And worse, you're going to cause a lot of tension in your roommate situation. Someone's going to get thrown out of the trailer, but you're all pretty poor. You depend on each other. You need roommates. And so there's also that element where, is it bad enough that I need to call the cops on the situation and then risk my own kind of peace in this relationship? Because right now the fire isn't directed at me. I still get to live in this trailer. So there's a lot of things at play as to why the police aren't called each time. They may be thinking, I'll call the next time. They've stopped. I'm here. At least I'm here. It's not getting any worse. This is no worse than what we're seeing here. Whether it's being dragged out of the car by the hair or whatnot, they're just young and passionate. That doesn't excuse any of it, but trying to explain how these witnesses can be testifying to pretty horrendous situations, but not have ever reported it to the police, and that they're not lying.
So all that's really bad for Leo. But there's some interesting things that come out in cross-examination and sort of the police file that make you wonder how accurate all of this is. The roommates we talked about, pretty bad. They lived with them. They witnessed these things. All those relationships ended poorly. When a bunch of people who don't have a lot of money are living together, it's pretty easy for things to get tense and acrimonious very quickly. These are people that Leo would eventually kick out of the trailer. These are people who left on really bad terms. We mentioned Mary earlier. I mean, she couldn't stand Leo. Michelle McCluskey's also interesting. So you might wonder, why would Michelle, her testimony is so aggressively anti-Leo. You listen to Bone Valley, to this day, she's very aggressively anti-Leo. And she and Leo and Michelle, they'd been best friends before the murder. Michelle had spent the night at the trailer. One of the nights they were looking for Michelle. Incredibly close. But by trial, she views Leo as a complete monster. Well, the simple answer might be that the evidence convinced her that this man killed her best friend, and so that's how she's going to view him. But there was something else going on as well, because it's the 80s. So of course it was going on. Michelle's mother, Linda, would tell David Somm that she had seen Michelle's murder in a dream. And in fact, she knew that it was an occult sacrifice planned from before Michelle and Leo were married, and that Leo's band was a front for a satanic cult. You just can't get away from it. So with that kind of stuff bubbling around in the community, you can imagine how people's views of Leo, even people who'd been friends with him, might have changed by the time of trial, and how that might color some of the things they were saying. And one reason, even though I think it's pretty clear this was a violent, volatile relationship, you can take maybe some of it with a grain of salt. Okay, I promise we're not going to spend 14 episodes on this case. We're really not. We are moving through it. We got a long way to go, but we're done with the timeline. We're really going to be getting into a lot of the evidence next time. We're going to talk about the autopsy. We're going to talk about how the autopsy and the timeline fit in, and the dump location. We're going to talk about the finding of the body, which is one of the most important things that happened. One of those things, we talk about this sometimes. Why do people get tunnel vision? Sometimes it's because something happens that is so weird that they just can't get past it. And that definitely happened in this case with the finding of the body and the way the prosecutor, John Aguero, viewed that. We're going to talk about Leo's clothes, what he was wearing. Was there blood on the clothes or not? What did the forensics tell us? What did the analysis say? We're going to talk about weird things about the jury. There's a lot going on in this case that I think you're going to find really interesting, and we are going to hit it all in the next couple episodes, and then we will pick back up the timeline and tell you about, really, this case. If we stopped before we picked up the timeline, it still would be really interesting and still would be a great case to cover. This case has some wild twists and turns. And by the time we get to the end of it, I think you're going to appreciate that.
Yeah. By the way, the second timeline is something that I think everyone who looks at these types of cases hopes will happen, and it never does. It's like a pipe dream. It's something that will never, ever happen in any case, and it happens in this case.
It totally does. It totally does.
So, in other words, please come back.
Yeah. Trust us. If you're not enjoying it up to this point, it only gets better. Okay, Alice, let's do some questions.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's see. Do you think the Murdaugh murders could have been planned as a murder-suicide and he chickened out? That's Jane Perillo. I don't think so. I think he always intended to survive, at least maybe until the second, the sort of quote-unquote suicide attempt. That was a real suicide attempt, maybe, but no. I don't think when...
No, you know why? Because it would have just been a suicide. There was no need for the murder part of it. Like, I mean, it would have just been a suicide.
Let's see.
Sadly. But I get what you're going, which is like... Again, the question that we all grappled with throughout the Murdaugh series: how can a father do this to his own child and his wife, but his own, flesh and blood, when he seemingly was a good father? And I've gone round and round on that, and unfortunately, I think the answer is just that evil exists.
Yeah, I think that's right. Clester, too, wants to know if we think the Ramseys were framed. And Clester, we have like 10 episodes on the Ramseys. You should go listen to them. And I think you will see what our opinion is on that.
You know what I think is really... So, obviously, we've covered a lot of cases that are hot, button true crime issues. But the one that I think I've seen come up more and more than any other case, even though there's a lot of cases that we've covered, is John Bonet. Like, it will just, randomly, someone will have this, beautiful, 7,500 word essay that they just send us. I'm like, whoa, that was a couple years ago, but yeah, let's dive back in.
Yeah.
And I think,
absolutely.
I mean, for good reason, but that case, we said it back then, and unfortunately, I think it's still true. I hope it's not true, but I think it is such a compromised scene that we will never truly know the answer. I'm hoping that, amazing advances will be made in science that we can know the answer one day. But as things stand right now, I don't know that the actual perpetrator is knowable right now.
I hope so. I am still hoping that technology will advance to the point we can have some sort of answer in that. And by the way, if you're into the Ramsey case, the consult, Julia Cowley and her FBI profiler friends just did an episode on the ransom letter. It was very interesting. Once again, the profilers have a very similar view as we do, so I don't know. I have to take back all my comments.
I don't know if that means that we're profilers or not.
Robin wants to know if either of us ever considered going into academia.
I did, but not for law. I thought I wanted to be an economics professor, and then I thought better of it. No shade on anyone who's an economist, but my job as an economist for a year, not an economist because I didn't have a PhD in it, an econometrician, a number cruncher for an economist for a year was literally the 4 floors down in the basement. So not like the first floor down of the basement, 4 floors down in the basement, beyond no windows. There was not even a window to be seen. And I had to walk up like 4 flights of windowless stairs in order to see daylight. And it made me realize that I really like people and I want to see people. So I did not go down that path of getting my PhD, but I've really enjoyed teaching law school classes, not, only as an adjunct professor, not as a tenure track professor. Those are very different. What the demands of those two roles are very different. But I've loved being an adjunct professor for multiple years. I don't currently teach right now because life is very full, but it is fun.
Yeah, I taught an evidence class and it was fun, but it's a lot of work, Not that I'm adverse to work, but it's like, I don't know. It was a lot of work. I mean, I was doing it while I had a full-time job and this podcast, so that it might be easier if it were your full-time job, but yeah, I don't know. Probably not. That ship has probably sailed. Okay. Let's do one more. I don't really understand this question, but I guess I'll ask it anyways. Big B wants to know why burner phones are legal. Because the government doesn't get to know everything that you do. I mean, I don't like.
Kind of like why VPNs are allowed,
Bitcoin,
why encrypted messaging is allowed, why our phones are not bugged. I mean, that's not, it's not a stupid question. A lot of things can be used for illicit purposes, but we have a right to privacy, right? And there are lots of things that are like burner phones that we all take as accepted, like using a VPN on your computer, like encrypted messaging, like being able to have conversations over the phone without them being bugged. That sort of thing. So a burner phone in and of itself is not an illegal device.
And criminals use all sorts of things to commit crime. We don't normally ban them just because a criminal. Why are crowbars legal? Criminals use them to break into houses.
Well, it would be over-inclusive, right? It would be over-inclusive to ban all burner phones because, like, burner phones, they have the street name burner phones, but burner phones are also like prepaid phones, right? Like if you wanted to give it to your child so that they didn't just have this roving plan and run up your cell phone bill, you're like, okay, you drive now, you're 16, you can drive. Here's, there's 25 minutes on this phone, enough to call 911 and me in an accident, but not enough for you to just talk to your boyfriend for hours on end, That's one use. Or someone comes from another country and they don't want to change out international SIM cards. So they buy a burner phone because that's a lot cheaper and a lot easier because they don't need a phone forever in the United States. They just need it for their stay if they're coming from another country. I buy those types of phones when I travel, abroad all the time because it's easier than switching out a SIM card.
So there you go. That's why they're not illegal. Okay.
But you're right. A small slice of the population can ruin it for the rest of us.
Though, I mean, the thing about burner phones, it's not like they're not traceable. We trace burner phones all the time.
There's still phones who use cell phone towers.
And, you have to buy them. The number of criminals who buy their burner phones for their credit card would surprise you. So,
and they use their burner phones for like a month at a time. Like a lot of people that we track will like throw away their phones every month, but we have a whole month to figure it out, It's
annoying because you have to get a whole new warrant.
Affidavit.
Yeah, every time they change numbers, you got to get a new one. So that's annoying. But anyways. Okay, guys. Well, look, I know a lot of you are already enjoying this. We've already seen people talking about it on the gallery, getting into it, listening to Bone Valley. So I hope you guys are enjoying it as well. We want to hear what you think. Send us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Join us on the gallery, which is our fan-run Facebook group. We're on it all the time, but we don't run it. It is run by the fans, for the fans, but we enjoy the conversation. Join us there if you want to get your episodes early and ad-free. Join Patreon, and you can watch these live, which is what we're doing right now with our best buds who talk about everything except the case and criticize me for mostly what happens in the chat. Not that I'm complaining. It's fine. And hello to everyone watching on YouTube. We love you guys. as well. All right, Alice, is there anything else you want to mention before we sign off?
No, I really enjoyed going through the state's case so far with you, but this is just the beginning. So I look forward to coming back and discussing this.
I can't wait. Can't wait to do it. And we will do it with all of you next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. The closest I ever did to a polar plunge is we just continue the humble bragging. I was in Budapest, and they have these like hot springs and like baths, like bathhouses, like these that are like 2,000 years old or whatever. And everybody goes, and like most of them are hot springs, but they have outside. It was in the winter. It was in January. Snow, ice everywhere, freezing cold. And then outside they had these like really cold pools that people would go jump in and then run out and run back to the thing. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try that. It was really cold.
Float and not sink down. But in my mind, it was like all these horror movies, and I'm like, I'm going to get sucked into the middle of the earth, into the continental divide, and disappear.
I think you sink first and then float.
Dang it, don't say that. Sink. Don't say that. But
well, you made it.
I made it. But that was a pretty cool experience because you got to like swim across the continental divide.
Hold on to your jingle bells. Pluto TV has all your holiday favorites for free. Enjoy our season's greetings category with 9 holiday channels, including holiday movie favorites by Lifetime, Festive Fireplace, Holiday Lights, and Hallmark movies and more. Download the Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming holiday favorites on live channels and on demand. With thousands of free movies and TV shows, Pluto TV is your home for the holidays. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.